All right, we're going to get started. This next session follows on very well from the session we had, the opening session, where we laid out the fundamental issues we have to come to grips with respect to how we deal with human habitation and nature in growing metropolitan urban areas. A lot of this and a lot of discussion at the end was about policy, metropolitan policy. And metropolitan policy is carried out at several scales. But the context for metropolitan policy is usually the national situation in which you're embedded. And so we thought we'd follow on with 4 speakers talking about national contributions to metropolitan policy. We're going to start with Australia and then go to the United States. And then we'll have an international expert talk a bit about this, and then follow up with a business perspective on these issues. So we're going to open with Dorte Ekelund. Dorte Ekelund is the Executive Director of the Major Cities Unit of the Department of Infrastructure and Transportation for the Commonwealth of Australia. The Major Cities Units are the federal government's first, I believe, unit of this type, dealing specifically with cities, their growth and development. Recently, that unit completed a national infrastructure, a national urban development policy structure based on the first compilation of data on the cities in Australia. Dorte brings experience with her in urban planning and development at the Commonwealth level, as well as West Australia and the ACT government. We're going to start with Dorte, and then we'll go to Tom Wright, who's Executive Director of the Regional Plan Association of New York, and I'll introduce him, and Rodin, Genoff, who will be our international expert, next, and then Peter Verwer from the business sector, who is the CEO of the Property Council of Australia. So without further ado, Dorte.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I've only got about 12 to 15 minutes, so I'll be skating across our work pretty quickly and not in a lot of depth. So I hope during the panel session that there might be some opportunities to get stuck into a bit of detail. For those of you who know Australia, it's a vast continent, but you don't always appreciate that we are one of the most urbanised countries in the world, partly because of our colonial past rather than an agrarian past. But I think it was Tom that mentioned this morning that 50% of the states lives within 50 k's of the coast. Here in Australia, 86% of our population lives within 50 k's of the coast. So despite our vast landmass, we very much urbanised and we hug the coast very strongly. We were established in, the Major Cities Unit was established in 2008, and we didn't really have a clear understanding of what the government wanted us to do, except the government knew that we needed to get back into understanding urban systems. And of course, in Australia, we're experiencing the same challenges as in other urban systems around the world. There's a strong need to retain a global competitiveness. We've been undergoing very high population growth by international standards. Of course, we're trying to transition into a lower carbon economy, and in dealing with climate change, trying to deal with the challenges of both mitigation and adaptation. And of course, people are central to our economies, our communities, and how we actually look after people is critically important. Now, there's often a lot of confusion about what indeed the federal government has done before in relation to urban policy, and we're not without a history. I wonder if this is going to work. So indeed, the Australian government was very much into urban policy in the 1970s and had a vaster organisation dealing with urban policy than my very small major cities unit. And under the Whitlam government, they were tearing ahead, but possibly so fast that the community and indeed other colleagues working in government at the time didn't really get how the Australian government should be working with states, territories, business and community in dealing with urban policy matters. So our sort of endeavours in the 70s were quite short-lived, though there are some very important legacies that have survived. In the 1990s, there was a program called the Building Better Cities program. It was reasonably well funded for the time. It was $800 million, and it certainly saw a lot of innovation in urban development in Australia. And it hasn't been without any bipartisan interest, because there was a House of Representatives a report into the sustainable cities that came out in 2004, which had bipartisan support for a whole range of initiatives of how the Australian government should work with other stakeholders in the urban policy space. So I mentioned that when Labor came to power in 2007, there were a couple of initiatives that very much spoke about the government's interest in urban policy and the view that there had been an underinvestment in strategic planning and infrastructure in the country. Most people would be familiar with the establishment of Infrastructure Australia, and they have a powerful role in influencing and prioritising the Australian government's investments in infrastructure around the country. And the Major Cities Unit was also established. Now, whilst we were working at the federal level, there was also a dialogue that was happening with the states and territories through our Council of Australian Governments, COAG, about, well, how should we collectively better organise and manage our urban systems? And from my perspective, that resulted in a really, really significant commitment in December 2009 to have a national objective about the future of our cities and a set of criteria, 9 criteria that should guide capital city strategic planning systems. And some of you would be aware that there's been a review of cities that I guess is still under discussion now. Now, getting back to what's been happening inside the Major Cities Unit, as I mentioned at the beginning, we didn't really have a clear view about what it was that the government wanted us to do. We sort of said, well, you know, you guys are the professionals, you go away and tell us what we should be doing. The first thing we felt we needed to do was to actually understand what was actually happening in urban Australia. What were the challenges facing the country and particularly cities? What was the trajectory of change that we were dealing with? That culminated in the 2010 State of Australian Cities report. Since then, we've also prepared a 2011 report, and I think we might have some copies at the back. And because we're producing the 2012 report at the moment, you're free to grab as many as you like, because we're clearing the cupboards out at the moment. Those 2 reports, so those of you that hear our Minister talk, Minister Albanese, would be aware that we've had, between those 2 reports, we've had in excess of 1.3 million full downloads of those documents, which would suggest to us there's a thirst for information about what's actually happening in cities. That then created, I guess, a bit of an information base that helped us prepare a discussion paper and a research paper that went out on public consultation, and we went and visited and listened to stakeholders in all of the 18 cities in Australia, which are over 100,000 people. That then culminated in the development of the National Urban Policy and its release in May 2011. Very importantly, we believe, is the fact that the National Urban Policy actually commits the Australian government to acting in accordance with the goals, principles and objectives of the National Urban Policy. Some of our colleagues haven't quite worked that out yet, but it's a pretty important commitment. You'll see that when you look at our national urban policy, there are 3 themes about productivity, sustainability and livability, and they should always be in that order if you see our work, because our government has the view that unless we deal with the productivity of our nation, we are less able to deal with sustainability and livability. Of course, they're very much complementary goals. I won't have time to I won't go through these in details, and I certainly won't have time to go through the contents of the National Urban Policy, but this is a bit of a snapshot of the goals, objectives and principles that underpin it. I think it's on page 21 or page 18 if you just want to get a snapshot of what it's actually about. And whilst the goals are about productivity, sustainability and livability, we recognise that good governance is critically important to achieving the goals and objectives. It is very slow, this thing. These 2 pyramids, I guess, are based on Maslow's pyramid of human needs, but it's really our Maslow's pyramid, if you like, of the planning system, and the Productivity Commission's recently just pinched it, but that's okay, we're happy to share. But it's really about the objective of trying to get from a system which is down into the micro and development assessment and having resources based on the micro without actually having paid any attention to the strategic framework that we're operating in. And I guess our objective is really to move to a situation where that triangle is inversed and where we actually establish the strategic framework first, and then we can cascade down into the detail, and hopefully the detail will be easier to deal with. Likewise, I guess the planning officials have been working on the concept of a line of sight from having a national perspective on what we should be doing in urban Australia, cascading right down into the local detail. And likewise, this line of sight doesn't just go one direction, it actually goes upwards as well for the local to inform progressively regional, state and national policies, so that we actually have, I guess, a nesting of policy objectives that informs how we actually manage urban Australia. And indeed, of course, there's the interrelationship between urban and regional. What we're doing now, so we released the National Urban Policy mid-last year, but we don't have time to rest on our laurels. There's much yet to be done. Another initiative that was started inside the planning officials, and that's basically all the heads of planning around the country, was the establishment of an urban design protocol to articulate what our aspirations are for urban design. That was released last year. And when, about the same time as we released the National Urban Policy, coinciding with that was a budget announcement for a Livable Cities program, which was like a tiny mini major Building Better Cities program, but very, very modest in size. But it has been very popular, and it might provide a model for something more substantive. And certainly our Minister has badged other initiatives, such as a $50 million funding for the Hobart waterfront as a Livable Cities type project. So we live in hope. I mentioned we've released the 2011 State of Australian Cities report, and we had to release the 2012 in October, November. The COAG Reform Council's review of capital city strategic planning systems was publicly launched in April this year, and it basically concluded that none of our jurisdictions meet all the criteria in the planning for their capital cities, but that the COAG Reform Council concluded that they are trying and people are aspiring to achieve better outcomes, and the agenda for the COAG cities' aspirations will now be taken forward by the Standing Council on Transport and Infrastructure, which is a ministerial council which has transport, infrastructure and planning ministers on it. Part of the National Urban Policy was a commitment to continue a dialogue with stakeholders, and so we formed the Urban Policy Forum, which has got eminent people like Peter Verwer on it, and some interesting characters like Clover Moore and Mike Rann. I think Romilly's in the audience too, Green Building Council. It's a really fantastic group, and it's a means by which we communicate what we're doing in the urban policy space, but very importantly get input from very talented, connected people. And one of the current pieces of work that we're working on is an active travel report. In the infrastructure and transport portfolio that we are part of, they generally like building or funding big lumpy pieces of infrastructure, whether it's railways, roads, etc. And I guess we're trying to forge an understanding of the legitimate role of walking and cycling as part of transport networks. And certainly cities have been fantastic in demonstrating the value of walking and cycling. And walking in particular, I think, is very overlooked, and it is our most critically important way of getting around, but we take it for granted and don't really think about it. The nation building framework, that is the framework that builds the big lumpy things. We've now had a review in our portfolio about what that funding program should be delivering on, and there's a recognition of connecting cities, inside cities, and possible role of active travel as well. Look, the last thing I just want to do is to acknowledge that, oh hang on, I better go back, is acknowledge that we're not the only people operating in this space. Yes, it's fantastic that the Australian government is doing work about cities, but there's been an incredible amount of work that's being done by all sorts of organisations in promoting the importance of thinking about the challenges that face urban Australia. So I'd just like to acknowledge the extent of work that's happening and the promotion of dialogue about cities, and you'll hear more about that when Peter speaks, including, I guess, putting their money where their mouth is, doing research and promoting the cause. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dorte. We're going to hear from someone who's been intimately involved in some of the U.S. urban policies, Thomas Wright, who's at the Regional Plan Association, which has been mentioned several times already today. Tom is the executive director of RPA and has worked extensively at the national and state levels. He was the state director of planning in New Jersey prior to taking on the role he's taken on now, but is deeply informed and will inform us about what's going on in the United States. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Ed, Sandy, Nicole, everybody. It's a real treat and a pleasure to be here. The last time I'd been to Australia was 25 years ago. I came with a crew team to compete at the expo in Brisbane, and I spent a few weeks sitting on my ass going backwards in a boat, and I didn't get a chance to see that much of the country. This is better. What I'm going to do this morning, actually tomorrow I'll be speaking on another panel, and I'll talk more about Regional Plan Association and the organization and our structure and priorities then. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the one national program that we have at RPA and how it fits in with what's been happening on a national level in the United States. I'm not going to go all the way back to the history of the urban agenda in the United States really coming out of the 1960s and the riots and things, but talk more about just the last couple of years and what's going on. I wanted to start with this slide, though, just to kind of orient you. This is the region that I work in, the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, tri-state metropolitan region. And RPA is a civic group creating long-range regional plans for this area, and that's what we've been doing. If you kind of back up and you look at the entire United States, you see, and this is a satellite photograph at night, and you see that we are a metropolitan country. Obviously, the United States, you can see the interstate highway system actually first planned in the 1930s, and it took about 20 years before the federal legislation was signed by Eisenhower to create that system. But we have built out around this system. What we did was in the 1950s, we started to build these highways, and from 1950 to 2000, the nation built in metropolitan patterns. And this is the way we live and exist today. This is our economy, this is our society, this is the way we function. But our federal system doesn't recognize this. Instead, we are divided into states and cities. There is, of course, an enormous anti-urban bias in the United States, and so we don't really recognize this reality on the ground in what we do. Looking forward, this is a map that was produced by my colleague Bob Yarrow and Marilyn Taylor at the University of Pennsylvania, kind of looking at the growth and what's happening to the United States. And this became the impetus for America 2050, our national program. This is a pretty remarkable map. What it's talking about is the fact that the United States is in a unique, actually maybe Australia shares this with us more than any other place in the world. We are an older country. We have infrastructure systems dating back to the 19th century that we rely on. In New York, our water supply and our subways and other things were all built 100 to 150 years ago. So we have mature metropolitan regions. At the same time, we are growing rapidly. And the United States is projected to add about another 130 million people between 2000 and 2050. Roughly the same amount of growth that we experienced as a country from 1950 to 2000, we will experience again over the next 50 years, from 2000 to 2050. Now, that growth over the last 50 years, it occurred on those metropolitan, we built that interstate highway system, and then that created the capacity for metropolitan regions to absorb that 120, 130 million Americans. What will be the system in the future? Because we built out on that system. We don't have capacity there anymore. The other thing this map shows is that the growth is uneven, that it's happening on the coast, and that the blue areas here are the places that are losing population. So even as our nation grows quite dramatically, we have places that are losing population. You could also say this is almost a map of where the voting, if you made the light red, shifted it to light blue, you'd probably get the McCain-Obama voting patterns. And you would see that this is kind of the division that my country is going through right now. In the red parts of this map, people are driving less and later. Young people now don't get their first driver's license until they are well into their 20s, whereas for me, on your birthday, you ran out, the first thing you did was you got that driver's license. Whereas in the blue parts of the country, they are moving more and more to homeschooling. And I think Fritz talked a little bit about the kind of cultural phenomena with their attitudes towards science. So the nation is dividing here, and the United States is moving in two very distinct directions. If we were to take this as a starting off point, there are obvious kinds of planning considerations that you would think about. And in particular, and Fritz showed this map a little earlier, but again, one of the things we've done is identify the megaregions, the networks of metropolitan regions, because we're no longer just a metropolitan country, but a megaregional country. The growth is now occurring within these constellations, and I should say that Armando Carbonell from Lincoln Institute, Lincoln has been our joint venture partner on doing this work and this research over the last several years. And what we've been doing together with Lincoln and Fritz at UT and other academic partners and people is kind of saying, if we were to take this seriously, what kind of planning would we be doing? If we were to recognize that the Northeast megalopolis is going to continue to grow and add people, but we don't know exactly where we're going to shoehorn them into New York City. But meanwhile, we have these other cities around New York that are at half the population they were at their peak in the early 1960s. Kind of obvious strategies would start to emerge from this. And so this has been an effort to work within, and often working with academic partners in each of these mega regions, kind of saying, okay, if this is what's happening in Florida, if this is what the Piedmont Atlantic mega region is looking like, what systems are in place? What systems would you be thinking about that transcend the state boundaries, and start to think about that? For us at RPA, of course, we've come back to home and we've started to look at the Northeast. For 90 years, we've been planning for the New York metropolitan region. And over the last 5 years, we've really started to say, well, many of the systems that we're concerned about, the landscapes, the railroad infrastructure, the air travel network and other things, they're not just confined to the tri-state region anymore, they're part of this megalopolis. And so we've started to think about these systems on this larger scale. Of course, also in our federal system, this would provide an opportunity for us. There are quite a lot of senators along this corridor, each of the states, the way our kind of power devolves in the federal system. If this region started to think and plan and behave collectively, we could garnish some significant resources. And so we've been looking at this at RPA and having meetings. We've created a group that we call the Business Alliance for Northeast Mobility to push for reauthorization of Amtrak funding. Amtrak, our national railroad system, is essentially kept kind of barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen by Congress. And so trying to get more resources for that institution and treat it respectfully is something we've been trying to do. Breaking out of this also, we've looked at systems, the freight network. The United States, an enormous amount of the goods come into 2 or 3 ports, and we should be thinking about how the goods are transformed around the country. And an obvious next one is high-speed rail. Alone among modern countries, we seem to be without really a true high-speed rail system. And so we did research on which kind of networks and where would investment in high-speed rail make the most sense. We had opportunities. Now let me kind of back away. So that's the kind of research that we've been doing on one side. Now let me talk about what's happening in the country as a whole. From 2001 to late 2008, there was very little reason for me or anybody else working in New York or other places to go to Washington, D.C. There was just not much going on in the federal government during an 8-year period, an interregnum in a way. There was a kind of the attitude towards housing and urban development and transportation and environmental protection was less is more and nothing would be better. And so there was really very little. There was no federal policy. There was no real looking at any of these issues. President Obama came in with an enormous wave, both of opportunity and challenge and excitement. As a candidate, he gave a speech to the U.S. Conference of Mayors where he announced, I will create an Office of Urban Affairs within the White House that will really set federal policy on cities. He was coming from Chicago. He was an urban politician, somebody who came from one of our great urban centers. That was truly exciting for us. He also had, as folks know, of course, to deal with the aftermath of the total destruction of our financial services industry and, unfortunately, the global impact that continues to have. And so he had both an opportunity and a challenge to try and deal with these things. And so what happened right after the election was real movement quickly on the ground. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was signed into place in February of 2009, just about 5 weeks after his inauguration, putting over $800 billion to work of stimulus funding to get into communities. Now, there was a lot of debate. Almost immediately, Keynesian economists, Paul Krugman at the New York Times most especially, started to say this is just a small amount of what we need given the series of the challenge. There was also a lot of recognition that to get the money in place very quickly, giving it directly to states which were facing catastrophic budget crises was probably made a lot of sense. And what we learned later was there was also a lot of disagreement within his advisors about the role of infrastructure and what it should take towards this. And many of the most influential ones, including the former Harvard president Larry Summers, were kind of skeptical that infrastructure would deliver the jobs or really make a lot of sense. But at the same time, there were about 6 or 7 purpose statements as part of this legislation, and the fourth one said specifically part of the funds were to invest in transportation, environmental protection, and other infrastructure that will provide long-term benefits. So here was, for the first time, maybe the only time in my life, enormous amount of federal stimulus funding that was going to go into infrastructure and was really something for us to kind of capitalize on. There was also, the same week that this act was passed, the creation of a White House Office of Urban Affairs. And so the following up on that promise and a real sense that something exciting was going to happen here. They put out, fairly soon after that, the U.S. Department of Transportation put out this kind of vision for high-speed rail in America, talking about what a modern system could look like. And we really started to feel a lot of optimism that the direction that we were going was going to start to move. We're still working on it, and I don't know if folks have followed this and what happened in Florida and in Wisconsin and other parts of the country. But it took a while to get this in place, and unfortunately, by the time the 2010 elections rolled around, there was a backlash against much of this. Much of it unfair. I mean, Obama gets pilloried for the TARP legislation, the Toxic Asset Relief Program, which was, of course, signed into law by President Bush. But they found themselves almost the day after much of this visionary legislation was passed, fighting, in effect, a rearguard action. And what they did at DOT was kind of take the money, and this is what the federal government tends to do. They took the funding for high-speed rail and they kind of smeared it like peanut butter across the country. This is not really a very strategic investments portfolio. This is not, it's clear that the places in the country where high-speed rail will give the biggest return on investment in federal dollars and pay the biggest dividends, mostly in the Northeast, since our region accounts for almost half of the transit ridership in the United States, is in or out of New York City. And it's virtually any project connected to New York is going to have better ridership and more riders per dollar spent than anywhere else, and in California, which has been moving ahead. But unfortunately, for various political reasons, the money was kind of put in drips and drabs. The other thing, and this is fair, is that recognizing that before we went to a modern, a truly 21st century high-speed rail system, investments and upgrades in commuter rail and making higher speed rail would probably be the right way to go, and that was fair. And so that was the decision that they took, and it didn't go that far. So that has been a bit of it still moves forward. California recently reiterated its approach to that. New York and New Jersey are starting to put some money in upgrading the Northeast Corridor, and we're seeing that. But it has not lived up to the ambitious proposals that we had. On the other hand, in June of 2009, a new initiative coming out also was announced, the Sustainable Communities Partnership. The idea here was that HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, and Environmental Protection should start to think collectively about how their investments and programs and regulations would work together. This was not going to be done with the same kind of splash, large-scale public investment of ERA or high-speed rail or other things. But it was more about building kind of within the DNA collectively, within these agencies and within the communities that they worked with, getting them to collaborate and work together. And this has really started to see some benefits. So the partnership was announced in the summer of 2009. To date, they just put out a report a few weeks ago, kind of updating. The main thing with this was providing grants. They were competitive grants that communities could apply for, and it was very clear in how they were written out that what they were looking for was collaborative efforts of regional planning that would bring many communities together and do sustainability around transportation, housing, economic development, environmental protection. To date, some $240 million have been given to 152 different communities working on them. One of those grants was given to Regional Plan Association. We were the leaders in a Connecticut-New York grant application. This is interesting, a nonprofit civic group getting direct federal funds. So the federal government doesn't give money to nonprofits. It doesn't do that well, but they've managed to with this program. Here were the principles that they were trying to lay out with this. And so the partnership, Sustainable Communities Initiative partnership that we are leading in New York, brings together 10 different communities and 6 other partners. And what we did was we identified a series of projects. We looked at, essentially this is built around the Metro North and the Long Island Railroad commuter rail networks. And we identified communities that had transit-oriented development opportunities where we could say improvements in the Long Island Railroad and Metro North networks are going to provide opportunities in these specific communities, and let's do planning in those communities to take advantage of the larger investments. If we had, without this federal framework, to go to those communities and try to say to them, let's talk about growth, let's talk about housing, it would have been so difficult. But a little bit of money, this was only a $3.5 million grant for us. Not really that much money at all. But putting some money on the table at the start of the process and allowing that money to come down to the communities has got the city of Bridgeport, New York City, Nassau County, and other places working on plans that are really incredibly ambitious. It's leveraged over a one-for-one match now from state and local communities, and developers in the real estate industry are coming into it too. So I'll end there. I'm getting the signal. But thanks. That's just a kind of chance to share some of what we're seeing in the U.S., and I'm delighted to talking about it with you later. Thank you. Sorry.
I have something other moderators don't have. I actually have the hook. Haven't had to use it yet. Rodin Genoff is an international expert. He's from Australia and doing work overseas, and I really want him on to show where the world is in terms of some sustainable development and sustainable development options and opportunity. He does industry and cluster development within cities. He works with the OECD and has just been part of a project to measure indicators of growth, and I'm sure that's sustainable growth. He's written a lot about these things, but not just in books, but in the ways that policymakers are informed best in magazines and so forth. He's worked in the United States, he's worked all over the world, and he's going to give us a view of what can be done. Rodin.
Thank you very much, Ed, for your very kind introduction, and I'd really like to thank the organisers here today for giving me the opportunity to share some of the experiences of my work I've taken overseas. I'm a fairly practical sort of person. I build clusters and industry clusters from the bottom up. We create jobs, we create investment, we spin off new R&D, and the work is about boosting local and regional productivity growth. Now, the work I've done in Australia, back in Adelaide, we spun off a 600 million born global automation and robotics consortia based on these clusters and collaboration model, spinning off some 1,000 jobs. Recently in Denmark, we undertook the most comprehensive industrial audit ever done in Denmark of capacity and capability. We spun off lots of opportunities, and that program has just been funded 50 million kroner to be rolled out across the industrial heartland of Denmark. So I'm very pleased today to be able to share with you some of those experiences and how we can put that industrial dynamic to use in terms of creating growth opportunities. So let's go, let's have a look. Let me take you to a ski slope. Isn't this beautiful? Everyone's having a really great time, but let's have a look at where this ski slope is. Is this working? Here we are. Here we are. This is just been approved for Copenhagen. We can see this beautiful building, the ski slope, and this is a waste management and recycling plant generating energy. And let's have a look. Let's have a look. Here you can see the smokestacks of the 20th century. And here we can see the architecture of the 21st century, an integrated waste management and energy facility incorporating leisure facilities and recreational facilities. And as we can see here, this beautiful building will give these little beautiful puffs of vapour that are then lit up by laser at night to show their carbon footprint. Well, this is what the future is looking like. These are some of the projects that are happening around the world. And let's have a look at the future, in fact, about what it looks like. Well, this may in fact be the new transport system linking Parramatta and Sydney in the not too distant future. And why not? Because the future is intelligent, it is instrumented, and it is interconnected. These are the words of our own scientist, James Moody, working for the CSIRO. And it's about those intelligent software technologies that in fact put the future to work. And let's have a look what we mean by this. Let's return back to Australia. We've all heard about the mining boom. This is the Pilbara. This two-storey giant is actually an autonomous robot being controlled from Perth Airport. Imagine that. And now imagine across the other side of Australia, right here in Western Sydney, in the University, I should say, of Sydney, is Rio Tinto's Centre for Mine Robotics and Automation. Now that's what we mean when we say the world is intelligent, interconnected. And let's now have a look. Oh, this is going too fast. Denmark. Let me return back. I'm doing so much work in Scandinavia, and I'm currently doing a project with the wind industry cluster in Denmark. And these are the sorts of projects that we here dream about in Australia. If only we could make something like this. But they're also moving on from the mere production and design of wind turbines. Let's go for a walk inside Vestas, one of the world's leading wind turbine manufacturers. And here we can see the inside of their design centre. We can see here that Vestas has the third largest supercomputer in the world, the IBM Firestorm. Now this is about complex data management. They're not necessarily just going to be making their money from selling wind turbines, they're going to be making their money from selling data, integrating data for the smart grid and being able to on-sell those technologies as a service to the energy sector in the future. And there's a look inside. Okay, further south in Austria, this is an extraordinary building. This is home to the Human Technology Project in Austria, one of the most important projects of its kind in Europe. And we think, oh my God, biotech, life sciences. But this industry has come from the automotive sector. This is a region that was home to the automotive components manufacturers that pulled together the capabilities around automation, robotics, spun off into machinery and equipment, making pharmaceutical equipment, and eventually spinning this off into some 9 billion euros worth of investment. And now they are anchoring themselves to provide green growth solutions for the future. And the important point here is that a region's industrial trajectory comes from the industries that it has. Let me give you a very warming example of a project we've just recently finished in Denmark, which is of a medium-sized engineering company, a heavy engineering company. They make these trucks. They also make pressure vessels. And what we were able to do is to put those companies to work in the region and transform their capabilities and to be able to unlock that future industrial trajectory. What we were able to do with this company is to shift it from heavy engineering to spinning off a new medical division. And let's have a look. What we were able to do. We were able to create collaborations between the companies it was working with. We created a collaboration with the biomedical cluster, the university and the health authorities. We brought an industrial designer in up front. And at the very beginning of the process, we used a design thinking framework to break them out of heavy engineering and to create this new medical division, which is now developing mobile breast screening units and mobile blood banks that is supporting the devolvement of health services back into the community, and that's also positioning themselves now to open up into other green growth opportunities. And the world, folks, is spiky with talent, and we need to think about how we can develop those collaborations to put the future to work. And so let's get practical. What does it mean for Sydney? How are we going to put our intelligent companies to work as we sort of use this particular model? And let's go for a walk around Sydney. Let's think Silicon Harbour, the IT crescent, and the creative industries that span from this part of the city as you cross the bridge into the software companies of Miller Street that extend through Western Sydney to those amazing engineering companies that, yes, we do have here in Sydney. And let's see what that means. It means that we can think about Sydney as an energy of a mega dynamic that Thomas spoke about earlier, and the cloud computing companies that can work together with the artificial intelligence companies that has put Vestas and that wind manufacturer into this new space, the control systems that make the products, and of course going right through to the logistics and satellite navigation and tracking system. Without these technologies, we do not have a green economy. We do not have a smart grid. We do not have an integrated transport system. These are so important for us to unlock that potential if we're to navigate our way through these particular industries. And when we look at the clean tech sector, I have just developed this for Copenhagen Capacity, the foreign direct investment arm of Copenhagen City and the OECD. Here we see the traditional areas of clean tech, renewable energy production. But in order to put those sectors to work, we need to think about intelligent engineering, the electronics and control equipment, the ICT and software that allows systems integration, and of course the financing and marketing and the creative industries. We have wonderful PR and marketing companies here. It's about using them to sell the global brand for those companies that will move into the new spaces. So, in summary, let's think about anchoring those opportunities by working with what we have. Let's think about transforming opportunities into hard profits, and let's think about the soft architectures of the collaborative governance required to marshal people and resources and business together to unlock those particular opportunities. And as I say in our team, and also to our clients that we work with around the world's moving so fast these days that the man or woman who said it can't be done is generally interrupted by somebody doing it. And I certainly hope that the delegates here of the conference can inspire people to get out and to keep you in front. So thank you very much.
Peter, you've got to follow that act. Peter Verwer is the president of the Property Council. His organization deals with the biggest property owners and managers in the country, and they have dedicated themselves very recently to metropolitan building. And that's better than city building, but metropolitan building. And they've put together the software, the information, and other techniques and technologies, been involved very much in strategic guidance, both here in New South Wales and across the country, and helping us become better, greener cities. So I thought we should hear from industry as to how they're reacting to all this. Peter Verwer.
Thank you, Ed, for that generous introduction or obituary. He was really saying, I'm from the dark side of the Force. Right. So what we've just heard from Rodin is very interesting because I see, all of this cluster work and the incredible enterprise and the investment which is being unleashed sits within frameworks. In many ways, they are apps for opportunities, and our cities are these amazing microprocessing organisms or entities or some sort of powering force which gives people more control over their lives, which generates prosperity, which improves our productivity, increases well-being and livability, and at the same time, when it's done properly, it maintains natural capital. So the question is, how do you actually get a framework which allows this to happen? And how do you get a balance between what public policy and what governments do and what these amazing entities do, many of which are done in partnership, and when you speak to the Americans, they've developed a partnership model. So it's said that the first step toward recovery of an alcoholic or a drug addict is a recognition that you've got a problem, an acknowledgement that you're not controlling your life, and a commitment that you really need to take charge. And then there's another 10 or 12 steps. So the good news is, when it comes to urban policy in Australia, we have definitely achieved step one. This is progress. This is definitely progress. And it's a world of difference from the last generation, the zombie land musings of public policy advocates who existed in a wasteland of basically urban policy frameworks. I say wasteland on the basis that it didn't exist. It wasn't prized. It wasn't seen as important. So compared to that, the sorts of initiatives that Dorte talked about before, where there is a major cities unit, an excellent unit. If you look at the Council of Australian Governments, what should be the Board of Directors of Australia, it isn't, doesn't see itself as that. They now have spatial issues on their agenda. Spatial issues, think of that. It's incredible. Even the Productivity Commission, all those zany people in treasuries, see a link between spatial issues and productivity improvement and improvements in livability and the life set opportunities of individuals and families and entrepreneurs. We have Infrastructure Australia. We have a range of think tanks in Australia. I think the Grattan Institute is still on its way, held up by fog. Nothing can stop them. They'll be here, that's for sure. The Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, these entities didn't exist. And you know what characterises them more than anything else? It's a culture of collaboration. It's not just setting up these institutional arrangements where we think about urban policy, it's the fact that strange bedfellows are collaborating these days, and that did not occur even a decade ago. The difference between the policy of the Australian Conservation Foundation and, say, the Property Council of Australia, well, there's a few issues there about defining growth. But on the rest of it, total alignment. And under those circumstances, it raises a fundamental issue. Why do we actually need governments to be involved in urban planning? Should I be saying here, in response to Ed's very specific question, is the federal government were no good at this, they vacated the field, now they need to do these 5 things. Well, I think we would have said that 5 years ago, but now I'm not so sure. Now our thinking is evolving because of a direct engagement in this area. So what the hell is he talking about? I'll come to that in a second. I've described some progress. So where are the shortfalls? It's these. Firstly, even though we now have all spheres of government interested in planning again and city building, if not nation building, it's not joined up in any way. Problem one, not joined up at all. For instance, you have the farce of last year, a population policy was released at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon on budget week. It's called taking out the trash, by the way. And we've got the urban policy. So the population policy is ridiculous. It's the assemblage of intellectual contraceptives. Oh my God, this has been recorded, isn't it? We have the urban policy, excellent document. It's rigorous, they listen to the marketplace, whatever. And then we have a whole bunch of regional programs. How do they talk to each other? Do they define a language of vision and action that can be operationalised and implemented? No, they don't. So that's problem one. It's not joined up at all. Our efforts aren't joined up. Problem two is that these policies, including the urban policy, have no real, definable, tangible, measurable goals. So, Dorte will have an opportunity later to say, oh, come on, Peter, that's a little bit unfair. But by goal, I don't just mean we should become more productive, we should be more sustainable, we should have better governance, etc. I mean, a goal is we should achieve this improvement in the delivery of childcare services. We should achieve this improvement in the access to these certain sorts of health services. And that's what spatially aligned policy does it not? And we don't have that. We don't have targets, and so that's a failure. And in particular, we don't have targets in terms of how can you use urban policy to charge up a productivity super cycle in Australia. The thing that we need more than anything else in order to help pay for sustainability improvements and livability. It doesn't do that at all. Our urban policies do not address the fact that we're moving out of a demographic sweet spot. They don't address the fact that taxes are going to double in real terms over the next 30 or 40 years because dependency ratios are falling. They don't address the fact that there's a hollowing out of our communities in regional Australia because people between the ages of 15 to 25, growth in those people over the next 20 years, there is no growth, it's all negative, right? For 40 cities across the country. Labour market growth, not number of people, not labourers, not thinkers, but labour market growth will halve over the next 20 years. The policies do not address any of these issues. That's a fail. I think that's a fail. The third fail is that they're not properly funded and that we're not using innovative public financing techniques. And the fourth fail is that we're not using modern mechanisms of governance in order to ensure that we're mobilising all of our scarce resources in order to achieve the sort of prosperity and improvements in opportunity and competitiveness and lifestyle while preserving natural capital that we should. Apart from that, these programs are very elegantly designed and spot on. So, one doesn't want to whinge. Oh, well, that was the whinging bit. So, the piece of technology that Ed mentioned before is called ournation.org.au. You can download it from iTunes if you like, or www.ournation.org.au. And what we tried to do there was to say, okay, if Australia's growing at a person net every 93 seconds, and every 93 seconds we need to deliver net, more than likely more software, by which I mean education, learning, healthcare, energy, water, mobility, etc., 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 office space, retail space, this are things we like as well. And then you need the hardware, which is the pipes for the water and the energy, the transportation for the food, the beds, institutions of higher learning. Surely this is the planning system. It's the planning system which does that. And that's that direct link between a planning system and productivity and livability is hardwired in there. And what we did, well, it was the Allen Consulting Group that did this, using the exact same methodology that Treasury uses in the most important publication produced in Australia, equal most important publication produced in Australia, the Intergenerational Report. What we did was we say, if these are the growth rates, and allowing you, the user, to determine what you think the appropriate net migration rate should be, very controversial, what is the likely population, where will people be, and what will they need? And here's what it says. Let's just take now to 2030. Right? There's a blink of an eye away. There'll be, another 6 and a bit million people. We'll need 2.7 million more houses. We'll need 130,000 extra aged care places, probably about 118,000 more retirement living places, all things being equal, with no growth in the share on that. 105,000 childcare places, 23 million extra square metres, 1 million square metres of office space, about 13 million square metres of retail space, and I can give you numbers for vehicle kilometres travelled, for terajoules, for megalitres of water, and all of the rest of it as well. But the point is, this is growth. This is growth. And the planning system helps us determine where the growth occurs. In fact, what a planning system should be is an optimisation system. An optimisation of scarce resources, these these assets, we have natural assets, economic assets, social assets, and governance assets. And the planning system should optimize them in order to produce opportunity, productivity, better lifestyles. So what would we have a clear sort of 5-point plan to fix all of this stuff up, which is use national competition policy model approaches, which have been very successful in the urban sphere, use these funding techniques, improve governance, blah, blah, blah. It's all on the websites. But just to finish, I would do these 2 things. If I could only do a couple of things. 1, I would put Pixar in charge of Australia's planning system. Because the most important, and this is very strange coming from a representative of the institutional investors and developers, the thing that needs, in order to do all the things that I've talked about today, we need to improve community consultation because we need to improve the credibility of the system, or as we used to say when I attended this fine institution, we need to improve our Habermasian legitimacy. Right? So unless I don't talk like that anymore. Otherwise I couldn't afford this suit. But the thing is, unless the entire system, the democratic part of the planning system, is more credible, then no matter what Stockland, Lend-Lease, Westfield do in terms of improving their sustainability, their social contribution, no matter what they do, how many 6-star buildings they deliver, it doesn't matter because people don't trust the entire system. So it's absolutely crucial for us that even if we reform the whole system, we did what each one of these speakers said today, and we took those American programs and applied them to Australia, it's absolutely crucial that we have more trust in the system. And the only way to do that is to improve community consultation. The only way to improve community consultation is for them to be consulted about something they understand. And they can't understand, I know I can't understand two-dimensional diagrams. I can understand movies. And we have the technology to do that. There is more technology in one 16-year-old's Nintendo game than there is in the entire planning system of Australia. Right? And that could be fixed tomorrow using the databases that Ed has championed over the last few years. So that's one thing I would do. And the second thing I would do very quickly is that the Americans are pretty good at doing what the Europeans claim they're good at. The Europeans claim they're good at subsidiarity. That is, working out the needs and delivering them as close to the people as possible, close to the communities as possible. Well, Americans do this much better, in my view, because they've got strong local government. But these are, whether they're using business improvement districts and tax increment financing, very innovative techniques for creating a mandate, a governance entity, and a funding entity whereby you can borrow money over a generation and you pay it off over in a generation at the same time that the dividends are delivered. All of these techniques, all of these apps exist. My doubt is whether the real answer is with the federal government. Maybe we can explore that during questions. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you all. I think, as my mother used to say, who put the wrong thing in the punch bowl? We have some really interesting observations, and Peter hit the nail on the head as he always does. If we're going to have clusters don't have any jurisdictional boundaries. If we're going to have productivity is both national, has spatial attributes and the like. How do we do this with a governance system that was invented? My great-grandfather was a slave in the United States, born in the 1830s. The government of the city he was born in has not changed. And so psychologically, we're still enslaved by a system that can't cope with anything like what you talked about. Metro regions, give me a break. COAC can come together, but does that deliver? And so I want to ask each of you, what's the next step here? Because there's nothing wrong with the ingredients in this cake, I just don't see the cake. So let's start with you, Tom.
Oh, you pick on me first. So what's missing? I mean, it's interesting.
What's missing?
Is
it because there's nothing missing in what you guys had to say in terms of substance?
Peter, I liked your comments and where you ended with this. I'll admit, in conversations over the last 2 days, hearing about the way you allocate federal, state, and municipal responsibilities, with apologies to any mayor or city council here, I've been kind of wondering, so what do cities do after all in this structure? Because they seem to do, frankly, so little compared to what we do. We push an enormous amount of responsibility and funding down to the local level. We do land use, we do education, we do sanitation, we do all these things. New York City as a corpus employs several 100,000 people. It's the Department of Environmental Protection, if it's spun off, would be a Fortune 100 company by itself. So we do an enormous amount down at that local level, and I think your comment is appropriate that we're doing quite well at it, and we've gotten very innovative, especially over the last 10, 20 years, out of necessity, because the cities were doing so badly. And mayors have been the driving force in the US system and have been the innovators. Mayor Bloomberg will probably go down as one of the greatest mayors New York's ever had, and we're doing enormous things there. The problem is we've got all these systems above the municipal level, above even the state level, and we just don't know how to ratchet.
You can't cross the Hudson.
I can't cross the Hudson, and I got to figure out, how do I get the federal government down into this level or get the municipalities up into this level? And I think Peter's comment is correct. I am a private nonprofit, and it is the NGOs that are going to be moving into this area. We created 2 generations worth of infrastructure based on a public authority model that was invented by Robert Moses, who figured out that as long as we never paid off the debt on the bridge or tunnel, we could keep collecting the tolls, and we could just put a couple pennies over to that debt and use the rest of it to fund the next project and the next project. But we've kind of run our course with that model, and that's why we're talking about PPPs and other things. We really are under-investing in that level of system.
But it takes another level of institution to do that.
To try and think at that level.
Across the Hudson and the valley and so forth.
Yeah.
But let Dorte come.
Sure.
What are your comments?
I think we've got a very strong interest in governance, but we're coming from a situation where our Constitution makes it very clear that states and territories are responsible for managing urban systems and investing in the social and economic infrastructure that underpins them. But yet we have a situation where the Australian government collects by far the largest proportion of the taxation base. And I guess my personal view is that the Australian government therefore has a responsibility to try to optimise outcomes for the Australian taxpayer. The Australian government at times says, well, why should we buy the problems of states and territories in urban systems? But we're already there. We're already investing vast amounts of money in urban systems because that's where people live. That's where our dollars primarily land. So I think it's early in our conversation, and it needs to be a long conversation about how we collectively achieve better outcomes in urban Australia. And I guess the Major Cities Unit has taken the approach that this is not a big bang exercise. This is not a huge funding program that if there's a change of government, they can just sort of disassociate themselves and cut it. Our work is about having a long conversation with our colleagues and with external stakeholders so that it's not possible for a legitimate Australian government to vacate the space. Having said that, that's sort of part of our mission, I suppose. The responsibility of governing our urban systems cascades all the way down, and we have such a variety of approaches at state level and in local government level that we really do need a bit of a shake-up. When we have a local authority in Western Australia that is 1.5 square kilometres in size, how can they be taken seriously as a significant player in delivering urban services for communities? And yet we have in Queensland large and capable and respected regional councils that can have a legitimate conversation with the Queensland government and indeed with the federal government. So
I think there's a really serious need, and we're looking very closely what's happening in New South Wales at the moment. There's a very substantial opportunity to both reform the planning system but also the governance of Sydney in how the state government coordinates its activities and has a relationship with local government. And it has an opportunity to look at governing the metropolis of Sydney, both by its planning system, how it organises its delivery of infrastructure and services, and also the shape of local government and to what extent local government is a partner in delivering outcomes for the community, as well as a voice.
I wonder, you know, if we all arrived here on the boat together today in the modern world, would we invent any of the kind of institutions we have? I suspect not, because you usually invent things with the resources you have. And in those days, you'd ride your horse one day north, one day south, one day east, and you say, this is the town. And Mossman, the horse, didn't die before he got that far. But we have government without governance, is my view. You talked as though this kind of governance system, Denmark, what are they drinking? Is the Pilsner there better than the stuff we're drinking here? What's going on?
Well, their water system is really great, so they've got great fresh water. I think the important thing here is it is about governance, and I think the new Danish government's come in. They've set very ambitious climate change targets. They have said, we will
But how do the people at the local level fit into that? Do they just roll over and say, great, we're all part of it?
I think it's also a culture and it's a tradition. They've been green for a long time. They've been doing a lot of renewable energies for a very long time. And I think it's a process. We want this to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen. It is a process. And drawing down on Peter's issue to do with, well, how do you get that community consultation? That is not an overnight thing. That takes time. And I think in the Danish example, it's in their DNA. So when they said, we will become a green economy, rather than just saying, oh, we're going to set up a green department to green the green economy, they have brought together Invest Denmark, they've brought together the innovation department, the technology department, the universities, and yes, that whole green agenda is cutting through them and bringing them together. Closer to home, where's a really good example of where that's worked? Actually, back in my hometown of Adelaide. Yeah. The state strategic plan in South Australia is extraordinary. If I can indulge just for one moment.
Okay. Just one moment.
The former Premier brought together 300 leaders into Parliament. They worked out a strategy. They worked out the KPIs. Those KPIs went back out into the community, doing what Peter has said, extensive community consultations. Those consultations came back and we gathered again in Parliament to sign off on that. It then went to Parliament, got introduced as a budgetary measure, and what we saw in the determination of new projects to meet those KPIs was multilateral bids between various departments. There's a great example of South Australia doing and leading the case.
That's great leadership. There's some states that don't quite have that.
Yes.
In the United States, all over the world, we have people from around the world where that leadership is not necessarily there. Do you force this on people, Peter? Do you hope it comes up out of the natural process? In New Orleans, the city fell down, as I mentioned. In Pittsburgh, the river was on fire. So people got the message.
Yes.
Hey, it's pretty nice out there. Nothing's happening here. We're the richest people on the planet. We have colleagues here from Indonesia who are getting richer, and colleagues here from China who are the richest people in the world. I want you to know I'm on your side. Colleagues from Korea who've done some really pretty great stuff and so forth. But even in every one of those places, there's this governance issue. I worked in Seoul. It wasn't easy. It wasn't one day, oh, we're going to take this river out. It wasn't like that, because Seoul is a multi-jurisdictional place too. So how do we do this?
Okay. Well, you did forget that the Danish have an Australian princess as well. So.
Oh, that turned the corner. Yes.
Makes a big public policy contribution there. Well, to answer your question, Ed, we've got these hierarchies, and they were all sorted out 100 years ago, and it's all not fit for purpose anymore. And so what would the new hierarchy be? The feds have a piggy bank. There should be strings attached to them doling out the money. And we've got a great model there. It's called National Competition Policy, which was a bribe to do the right thing. The states all should have got rid of their inefficient enterprises, but they were bribed to do it. Now, who cares? We can use exactly the same technique here, but it was a bribe for them to do the right thing. And when it comes to planning, it's still up to the states and local government to do the doing. The key area for state reform is for all of the states to have a South Australian model. What we just heard there was about having, what do we call them? Oh, goals.
Oh,
Yes. Right?
yes.
So the
goals, targets.
The goals can be broad, but they can also be in relation to Indigenous enterprise. You know, it can be as specific as patents. It could be that no family should be more than 30 minutes from a childcare centre by car or public transport. Right? And then you organise everything to achieve that. And the beauty of the state governments doing this is that when the goals conflict, you can sort it out. Which is, whereas here we can have the happy state of, we want affordable housing, but we also want to do a whole bunch of things which sound good but make houses less affordable, and you're allowed to hold two thoughts at the same time. That's not leadership. But targets are the way to do that.
Yeah, I agree.
When it comes to local government, which is really going to be crucial here, so theoretically we should hate local government. And, well, we actually do. But the thing is, it is an essential answer to the modernising of governance, because without local government involvement, then we won't get the community
Involved.
because
They'll distance themselves.
yeah, they feel, people
Put
like
upon.
local government. They like the idea of local government, they don't like the way it operates. So local government has to change, though. In Australia, I mean, Dorte gave a couple of examples that you've got councils in Australia which are slightly larger than the owner's corporation of a big block of flats. What you need to have is local councils which are in control of important things, and then you get powerful, talented people wanting to be part of them. Great example, Brisbane. Better example, Auckland. Right? Non-examples, Adelaide, Perth, Sydney, Hobart, Launceston. You know, these are too small. They're not in charge of anything that's really sizable. And the second thing they have to do is, especially if local councils want to be recognised in the Constitution, which is their big thing, you know, and give it to them, as long as they do this: adopt all of the mores of the Westminster system, including the application of the separation of powers doctrine. Subject yourself to the discipline of consulting with the people, acting as a local parliament to make laws and rules, but don't sit in judgment. An example of which is development applications.
Well, I want to turn this over to the public out here. There's a gentleman right there very anxious to get in, who has a lot to say. Pat.
Peter and Dorte, I agree with you, Peter, about the incentives for the states to reform their planning systems, and Dorte, you referred to the 2004 or 5 Sustainable Cities Parliamentary Committee, which recommended the same thing. You must have some insights as to why such a system hasn't been adopted when it was so successful with the National Competition Policy. The suspicion obviously is that politicians can't help but actually just fund projects and fund particular regions, as we've seen in the example that Tom gave, but I'd like to hear your view about why what is such an eminently, obviously, obviously good way to go about this hasn't been adopted.
Dorte?
Look, we've discussed that approach quite a lot with Treasury. I have been involved in the interdepartmental committee that's looking at housing affordability, and the issue of development assessment reform comes up in it to actually streamline planning systems, etc. Often, I mean, planning systems really get hammered and planners really get hammered, but people seem to forget that planning operates within a political environment. And I absolutely agree with Peter that in order to get real reform of development control systems, there has to be a reward for good behaviour. And so in talking to the Treasury officials in the Australian government, I have said you are unlikely to get real reform unless there is such an incentive like the competition policy approach. So it's a conversation that's definitely been occurring inside the Australian government. Of course, our our budgetary situation with a commitment to be in surplus hasn't made it particularly easy to come up with initiatives such as this, but I'm hopeful that there'll continue to be a conversation about those opportunities, and I will continue to have the view that if the Australian government is serious about helping states and local government to achieve reform in terms of microeconomic reform in that area, then that's going to be the best way to help.
I think there's, I'd like to get some empirical evidence on this. One of the legacies I left behind in New Orleans was to take the politicians out of planning. Mm-hmm. There's a new planning commission in New Orleans. People were appointed for 12 years, so they're beyond the cycle of any elections.
Good for you.
Only 1/3 of them are turned over at a time. There have to be people, architecture backgrounds, et cetera, on the commission, but they cannot be practicing in the city of New Orleans. But they can come from the region. I think independent planning commissions, Ekelund and so forth, where I'm from, make a huge difference in carrying out long-term plans. And under the law in California, if the politicians want to make a change from the planning commission decision, they must change the entire plan by law. I think that would go a long way toward allowing local governments to stay where they are, just as they are, but the local government would then have to appeal to the planning commission that has a long-term view and prove that they are going to help make that view better than the commissioners, right, like in New York City.
And New York's City Planning Commission is really a model. I just want to say that also applies not just to the planning entities, but also the implementation, the public authorities. And Jim Doig, my friend and former colleague at Princeton, used to say the public authorities were established to have independent boards that way so that they could do governance without politics. And what's happened is that that independence has eroded. What governors have literally discovered is if instead of appointing somebody new for a 6-year term when the position opens, I leave the person in for the unexpired term, I can then remove them at any moment, and I let them know, not so subtly that's the case. And so those once independent, quasi-private entities have the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, that were supposed to operate that way, no longer do.
It's too bad.
And so they no longer have the independence to really invest in the projects. And the other thing, and I think to some of the issues that have been raised, is there's no longer a willingness. It used to be that if we saw a problem and we didn't have an institution in place to address it, we would create something to do that. And nowadays, we no longer do that. Munich, 15 years ago, took their energy, their transportation, and their sewage authorities, and they merged them into a single self-funding public entity that now doesn't require any subsidy on an annual basis to pay for mass transit because it comes out of the ratepayers for sewage and energy. That's just a brilliant idea. Hong Kong, obviously, as people know, they fund their capital investment in transit out of real estate development. Those are wonderful ideas that I don't see any U.S. cities or metropolitan regions being willing to
We'll probably have some
experiment.
people from Hong Kong. We got a question back there.
Thanks very much. I wonder if the panel would comment on the likelihood and wisdom of a high-speed rail link on the east coast of Australia by 2030 and what it might take to get such a thing up and running.
We'll start with you, Peter, because you'd know more about that than anyone else.
Well, Dorte and Albanese have done the study, and they're doing the second part of the study. We love the idea of connectivity that's efficient. We think that there's a strong argument for a high-speed rail link. The issue is what sort of high-speed rail link. The only thing that there's going to be a money issue and there's going to be a sort of a mandate issue here. What we don't understand is every opponent to a high-speed rail link says that Australia doesn't have the population.
We do.
But if you look at
corridor.
the population of the areas in France where they have the TGV, which was started in 1983, we have greater density of population. And so, yes, at the very least, you would reserve the corridors for it tomorrow. And yes, I believe that growth area bonds or tax increment financing and potentially a sliver from the Australia's Sovereign Wealth Fund. Oh, God, we don't have one. Timor-Leste has one. We don't have one. That you would take some money from that in order to capitalise it. And what it would do is open up all of the regions and you'd have even more cluster opportunities.
Okay, so one vote for the high-speed rail here. The thing, I just want to comment on this. We don't even have low-speed rail. So in the US, you could argue it's not needed because Amtrak. But here, without low-speed rail, and we have one of our speakers, maybe he's here now, couldn't get here because of air travel. What if this were a liver and you needed that transplant? Increasingly, and this is one of the reasons California is doing this, Los Angeles, San Diego, and San Francisco are now the technology meccas for the world, and the scientists move back and forth in that corridor on an hourly basis, and the air is not the way to do it. Moreover, the technology moves on the high-speed rail. So California is not, the way California is doing this, because California is broke, technically. Totally broke. The Japanese are going to build it for California. It's a PPP. And the Japanese need the money and the work, and California will pay it back on a long-term basis. So I think we have to look at, all of our cities were created to do things economically. They were not created for residential space. This is the Second World War notion of this residential space thing. We now have to get back into the pre-Second World War, where the economic activity is a dominant force, and the residential space is an adjunct activity that should be livable and all that kind of stuff. One more question, and then we're out of here. One more? Going. Lady in the green. Rumley.
Appropriately, I'm from the Green Building Council. Dorte, you're probably not going to answer this question, but I'd like to hear from Peter. When the COAG Reform Council came out and you did talk about this, it was quite clear that the states need joined-up thinking with their policies and departments, and they're not doing it. South Australia is probably the best example of it. Why aren't they doing it? Because they all reacted and said to the COAG report, oh, so you think we should be like South Australia? That's not what the report said. The report said you all need to join up your thinking and stop acting alone and get all the departments to work together, and it's just not happening.
I'm happy to, I guess, make a comment that when COAG in April formally moved the city's agenda into the Standing Council of Transport and Infrastructure, it, in one way, was a bit sad that it's gone off the main COAG agenda. But the main COAG agenda is usually the most political agenda. Moving it into the Standing Council on Transport and Infrastructure provides us an opportunity to work with the jurisdictions on, I guess, progressing the city's agenda and talking to them about indicators. And the jurisdictions might be uncomfortable talking about indicators and certainly may be uncomfortable talking about targets. But again, we have a situation where the Green Paper for Reform of Planning in New South Wales is actually talking about the establishment of indicators and targets. So maybe together South Australia and New South Wales can actually help there be a national dialogue about how we actually do better integration and actually think about specific indicators and targets. But I'm always at least half glass full, if not 2/3. So I'm hopeful that.
Well, Queensland's doing some of this. some of it.
Well, the issue is, and I guess Romilly was alluding to it, is that all sorts of people are working on indicators. There's indicators all over the place. They're collecting data, but is it being collected in
To make decisions.
in a consistent fashion? And are the indicators consistent? And they're not. So I guess I'm keen to have use the Standing Council on Transport and Infrastructure to give us the mandate to not just produce our own State of Australian Cities report, but to actually have the jurisdictions work with us to go, well, what are the crucial indicators? What are the crucial bits of information we need to know about cities? And indeed, what do we want to achieve for cities?
I think, Ed, there's the difference between indicators and targets.
Yes.
Indicators is just not a problem. We can have lots of indicators. You know, in the South Australian example, the indicator is, you know, how long does it take by various modes of transport to get typically from a family home to a childcare service. The bureaucrats are going to love indicators. They got allocated $10.1 million to develop a dashboard of indicators. It's still on its way. Right? We could have done it this afternoon.
Yes.
Right? No problem. You know why they're taking so long? Because inevitably, once you get the indicators, somebody's going to say, well what's the target? Yeah. So, I mean, it's answering the question that was raised before, which is, well, you know, Paul Keating, quite unfairly, I think, once said that Bob Hawke was a shiver looking for a backbone to run up. And that pretty much typifies the political response to this, because the politicians are being advised by bureaucrats, and for a bureaucrat, the idea of a target, right?
Scary.
A target is accountability, and accountability equals punishment. Right? And so it is only the politicians who can say, well, you know, take this job or get out of this job. I prefer the American system. Get rid of the lot every time there's a new political leadership in place, and that would be my third recommendation.
Well,
today.
I want to take your third recommendation. Our lot's finished, and we're getting rid of ourselves so you can have lunch. I want to thank the panel for their contributions. I think they were marvelous and stimulating even more discussion. Over to you, Nicole.
Absolutely. Once again, lots of common ground and lots to disagree with. So let's firstly give a round of applause and then thanks to each of you. So I want to tell you we've got lunch downstairs. After lunch we've got an organised round table in the McRae building. There'll be people on hand in the McRae room, I should say, there'll be people on hand to help you find it. And it's also the commencement of the parallel session, so there'll be some research paper and discussion sessions starting as well after lunch. And that's at 1:30, isn't it, Sandy? Okay, so see you downstairs.
Okay.